Lucia broke the wax seal with a single, deliberate pull, and a thin fragment of red fell onto the oak boards between her fingers and the archivist's palm. He reached for the fragment before it touched the floor, and the skin at his fingertips prickled with suspicion. The vellum beneath the flap had been smudged with a brown that read like dried blood. A sigil half, formed in the left margin, glowed under the lamp's hard cone. The archivist stepped forward and said, "Lucia, stop." His voice was low. The urgency in it made her freeze and leave the page exposed. Within 5 sentences the problem was visible and concrete. The chest's pages matched symbols found at a recent clandestine scene, and those pages contained procedural instructions that appeared to be used in the present day. The archivist's background was plain in the way he moved. Decades of cataloging had shaped his hands and posture. He had worked nights in the Vatican vault for 27 years, moved folios by measured counts, and known which seals were ceremonial and which were warnings. He did not shout, he did not pretend ignorance. He picked up the vellum with a gloved hand, turned it and read the marginal ink aloud to Lucia. "Lucia," he said. "This notation corresponds to the altar token reported to Inspector Aldo." Lucia swallowed and met his eyes. "Aldo called an hour ago," Lucia answered. They found the token at a ruined chapel. He wanted to keep it out of press sight. She touched the sigil with a fingertip and drew back when the ink felt tacky. The archivist's suspicion hardened into a plan. He closed the gap between observing and acting by taking a photograph of the page with a small, concealed camera he used for cataloging. He worked quickly, avoiding the chest's outer stamp and ignoring the cardinal's posted hours. He and Lucia had both seen enough to understand the stakes. If the manuscript contained living ritual procedure, leaving it sealed would allow those rites to continue without intervention. Opening and publishing it could seed instructions to new readers. That dilemma pressed against his ribs like a physical weight. He explained the concrete choice without naming it. "We verify, we find the chapel, we match token to text. If the rites are active, we record evidence. If they were not, we reseal." Lucia nodded, but her hand trembled on the camera. The trimmer showed her fear. They moved out into the archive corridor with the chest relocked and a single, small photograph saved on a memory card. In the stone corridor the air smelled of beeswax and old leather. Passages of footsteps echoed in the vaulted space. Inspector Aldo met them at the threshold with the altar token wrapped in a cloth stained the same brown as the folio. He handed the token over and did not wait for an invitation. This came from Sant Anselmo, Aldo, 2 candles burned to stubs. There was clay impressed with the same sigil. Someone tried to wash blood from the floor. He set the token on the table and left his jacket unbuttoned. The archivist placed the token atop the photograph and held both up to the lamplight. The carved curve of the token matched the marginalia's loop exactly. He felt alarm slide into him, changing his body. His hands closed into a firmer grip, his breath shortened, and he spoke in short sentences. "Lucia, match the token to the folio's marginal note," he instructed Aldo. "Where was the chapel?" 3 miles out the rural lane past the olive groves. Aldo replied, "A custodian reported a ceremony last night." "The custodian left before I arrived." He folded his hands. "This token came from the altar. We found fresh wax in a ring. The match altered the situation." Lucia's initial nervousness hardened into purpose. Her fingers stopped shaking while she traced the sigil on the photo. The archivist felt a second emotional shift. Suspicion became alarm, then set into grim determination. They had to know whether the archive's contents were descriptive historiography or active instruction. Cardinal Moretti arrived minutes later with a thin envelope and an expression that closed when he saw the open chest. "Seal this again," he said. "You are overstepping your clearance." He did not raise his voice, but the command carried institutional force. The archivist, "Cardinal, there is evidence that the ritual instructions were used last night. We must investigate." Moretti's jaw tightened. "No. The archive guards knowledge for oversight, not for publication. Close it and report nothing to the press." His hand tapped the envelope restlessly. Lucia answered, "Cardinal, there are traces at the chapel. Inspector Aldo is already involved." Her sentence was short. She kept her words to facts. The exchange grew heated along a narrow channel. The archivist pressed in. "Cardinal Moretti," he said, "if rituals are active, people are at risk. Hidden practice does not mean harmless practice." "Archivist," Moretti replied, "secrecy preserves order. Exposure invites imitation. Exposure can also stop an assault." Aldo interjected, "I found blood. I found wax burned into the floor." People were there. 3 quick lines, then a brief rhetorical volley. The argument showed clear positions. The archivist and Aldo demanded investigation. The cardinal insisted on containment. The dialogue contained a rapid back and forth of 4 more lines. "You will reseal the folio, Moretti. I will not send people away from evidence, Aldo. You will obey church procedure, Moretti." The archivist stepped between them and said, "We do this quietly. I will photograph the key folios. Lucia will accompany me." An unspoken break in the argument followed as the cardinal's expression closed into private calculation. He left without further argument, but his silence carried threat. After Moretti's departure, the archivist and Lucia prepared in the study. They gathered a folded copy of the photograph, a spare set of gloves, and the antique key the archivist always carried on a cord. He did not mention that the key had another use. He only looped it around his wrist. Lucia packed her satchel and tucked the vellum fragment into a small envelope. They left before dawn, moving with measured speed down stone steps wet from condensation. They reached the ruined chapel at first light. A low fog clung to the ground between broken pews. The chapel's altar stood scorched and half covered in clay. Wax stubs lay in a ring, and the wet clay at the altar bore an impression that matched the photograph. A shadow custodian was present, kneeling with his back to the easel, hands folded. The archivist stepped forward and said, "We have reason to believe this altar was used last night." He showed the folded photograph to the custodian. The man rose slowly and did not hide his exhaustion. "I found the circle at dawn." The custodian said, "I thought it was an old marking. I did not know people came. I thought no one used this place anymore." He touched the clay with one thumb and flinched at the wetness. "Did you see anyone?" "Lucia, no. Footprints in the mud lead to the olive lane and vanish at the wall," the custodian answered. The custodian's reluctance showed a new emotional shift in the archivist. From determination to unsettled doubt about how many people knew and how deeply layered the secrecy ran. He recorded a short audio note on his pocket device and photographed the altar. Lucia gathered the wax stubs into a small bag and handed them to Aldo, who arrived shortly after, his coat dusted with field soil. "Good work, Aldo." He checked the bag, tamped the wax between his fingers, and then watched the archivist with an investigatory patience. "This clay impression matches the token. Someone performed the rite within the last 12 hours. We have enough to open a quiet inquiry." The archivist felt the tension increase. He had concrete evidence and a partner in Aldo, but his path forward narrowed when Brother Valen appeared in the archive that afternoon and intercepted him. Brother Valen blocked the inner vault alcove with a slow step and a dark cloak that hid his hands. He spoke without preamble. "You have been correcting the archive's purpose," he said. "You photograph pages you were told not to record." The archivist answered plainly. "The archive preserves knowledge. It also carries responsibility. If texts instruct living rituals, we have a duty to act." Valen's reply was not an argument about duty. It was a revelation of intent. The archive guards those rights, so they can be contained and, when necessary, directed. The custody is selective. We do not destroy because control over practice is a form of governance. The archivist was struck by a new emotional shift. Betrayal. The word did not appear as an abstract label. It showed as a tightening at his throat, the way his hands became quick and precise, the way his mouth closed on a syllable. "Brother Valen, you mean to preserve ceremony so it can be used." Valen did not hesitate. "We keep the procedures because some actions must be contained. Erasing them spreads the risk. If the rites exist in practice, containment allows us oversight. If the rites vanish entirely, uncontrolled groups will reconstruct them badly." The archivist's reaction was physical. He turned the photograph in his hand until the memory card's light blinked. "You are choosing to let people perform dangerous rites for the sake of institutional power." he said. Valen's face, when he pulled back his hood, was not youthful. He had the same gaunt features as the archivist, but younger and more worn. We choose the lesser evil. You are not suited to that calculus. The exchange escalated. Brother Valen advanced and forced the archivist against a shelf of bound volumes. He produced an object wrapped in linen and set it on the table with a slow action that eliminated negotiation. A registry opened to a page where an entry had been altered. The registry line showed the chest as unopened that night. The entry has been changed. The archivist. His hands traveled to his pockets and found the key, the camera card, the photograph. Valen watched him while the archivist realized the choice he faced would not be only moral but practical. Why is the registry altered? The archivist demanded. Valen's voice was level. To protect the guardianship, he put his palm on the vellum and did not flinch. You can take this matter to Rome. You will be silenced. Or you can accept a quiet custodianship. The archivist stepped back and said, If I accept that, I'm complicit in the continuation of these rights. Valen's response was precise. Complicity is a manageable risk. Exposure is not. At that moment, Lucia's absence was felt like a physical shift in light. She had gone missing. The archivist reached for the satchel Lucia always carried and found it gone from its hook. The registry's altered line and the missing satchel combined into an external event that accelerated the plot. Lucia's gone, his voice was thin. Aldo's hands went to the satchel's place and closed into a fist. Where was she last? He asked. Valen, she left on her own. You were heavy with decisions. He did not offer more. Aldo's next actions were quick and direct. He searched the archive registers for sign-ins and sent 2 officers to the lane outside Sant Anselmo. The archivist watched the officers go and felt a new emotional shift. Alarm turned into a cold resolve anchored in secrecy. He could not trust the registry or his colleague's silence. He felt betrayed not only by Valen but by the institution's structural choice. Back at his small study, he opened his locked private cabinet and removed a single preserved folio from a hidden pocket. He slid the photograph into a ledger and placed the ledger into the cabinet with deliberate slowness. His fingers were steady. He trapped the folio between 2 pages and locked the metal clasp. The lock clicked as the lamp blinked. In the night that followed, the archivist discovered more concrete evidence of interference. The photographs he had taken were partially corrupted when he viewed them on his workstation. A smear across the images showed an irregularity in the ink pattern that could have been caused by a physical smear or a digital manipulation. Someone removed pixels or smeared ink. The evidence is altered. He sat with that fact and wrote a short entry in his private ledger. Date, time, folio reference, token match, witness names. He wrote without rhetorical flourish. His entry recorded decisions, not feelings. The ledger included a single line that captured his choice. He would continue in secret. The archivist's resolve culminated in a small, decisive act. He took the antique key from his wrist and fitted it into the cabinet's lock. He turned it twice. The sound of tumblers falling into place was precise and final. He wiped the key on his coat and placed it in a different pocket. He did not tell Aldo where he had put the saved folio. Before he closed the ledger, he left a single note for Lucia in the margin of the preserved folio. The folio's corner bore a puncture of ink in a script they had shared for years. The note was not a plea. It was a marker. The archivist folded the page and slid it between the ledger's covers. Outside, a knock sounded at the archive's heavy oak door. The archivist paused, held the ledger and moved toward the sound. When he opened, no one stood there but a folded paper left on the lintel. It contained one line in an official hand, registry corrected, all items sealed, no breach recorded. The paper was stamped by an office he recognized. Yet the stamp felt counterfeit in its timing. He put the paper into his pocket and closed the door. He sat at his desk with the lamp burning and the locked cabinet across the room. He felt the last emotional shift of the chapter. From tangled betrayal to a quiet, dangerous resolve, he understood now that knowledge demanded custody in more ways than one. His final actions were exact. He sealed the private ledger with a strip of wax he had warmed, pressed the preserved folio inside, tied a cord around the volume, and slid it into the cabinet. He turned the key once more and noted the way the metal bit felt under his fingers. He left the lamp on a low wick over the desk. He did not write a closing confession, nor did he record a promise. He made a practical choice: to continue the investigation in secret and to guard the preserved folio himself. The chapter ends on a specific, concrete beat. The archivist took the cabinet key, wound it into the cord on his wrist, and left the archive corridor for his small room above the vault. The last image is a locked cabinet, a single preserved folio inside, and the archivist's shadow on the stone wall as he closed his own door. He had sealed his duty with an action, not an oath. The ledger lay behind glass and iron, and the lamp continued its steady burn as proof that someone still watched the pages. Emotion root suspicion. Emotion shifts. Suspicion, alarm, determination, betrayal, resolve. A parcel scraped across the stone threshold and stopped at the archivist's boot. He crouched, lifted the packet with 2 fingers, and the scent of iron and beeswax rose into his nose. Suspicion tightened his hand as he turned the wax and saw the sigil, an identical stamp to one of the sealed folios he had catalogued only weeks before. Lucia, he said, and the name pushed air from his chest. He did not tear the parcel open in the corridor. He carried it into his private study with the lamp guttering low and set it on the table beside the folded vellum notes he habitually kept within reach. For 3 years he had managed the archive's sealed materials. For 3 years he had told himself the seals were inert. Documents damp with age, dangerous in theory only. The parcel argued otherwise, the sigil argued otherwise. He opened the flap with a thumbnail and found a folded vellum, edges damp with fresh blood. The margins bore a notational stroke in a modern hand and a list of names. Suspicion became calculation. He called for Lucia. She came within minutes, breath fogging at the study threshold, hair pinned back, fingers stained faintly with ink from her own work. You found it. Lucia, and she did not step forward until he held the sheet out. This was under my desk last week, she said. I thought it was a prank. Her voice was thin. They sat at the reading table and laid the packet between them. The archivist's spectacles caught the lamp light. Lucia's throat worked. He traced the sigil with one fingertip and felt the papery grain beneath his nail. The marginalia contained a modern surname. The surname matched a cleric listed in the clerical rosters he had reviewed the previous month. He the name aloud. Lucia read it and paled. Her hand went to the folded vellum notes in her satchel. Doubt rose in the archivist's chest. He remembered the red wax fragment that had fallen in Chapter 1 when Lucia had opened the first sealed folio. He had plucked the fragment up between them then and felt an odd prickling on his skin. He mentioned that fragment now. Lucia's fingers brushed the old scar along his left cheek as she leaned in. The gesture said more than her words. We need to compare this to the folios. Lucia. She set her jaw. Her voice carried a resolve that softened the archivist's hesitation. They moved, quietly, down the corridor toward the vault. The archivist carried the packet. Lucia bore 2 lamps. At the vault door they paused. The archivist fed the packet under the door's hatch and placed a keyed token beside it, a ritual of custody he had used earlier to log sensitive materials. The vault's iron groaned when the curator unlocked it. The curator's face was brief and pale in the lantern light. He took the packet with careful, gloved hands and read only the top line before his expression closed. Brother Matteo arrived within an hour. He did not sit. He leaned against the antechamber wall, arms folded over his clerical coat, and asked in a voice that held a controlled coldness, "What was left at your door?" The archivist explained. Brother Matteo read the syllables of the named cleric and made a soft sound between dismissal and warning. You should not pry, archivist, Matteo. Some things exist to hold danger away. His mouth was flat. His eyes scanned the lines of the vault like a man checking a ledger. The archivist pressed. Who does this list names for? He asked. Lucia watched Matteo while the curator folded the vellum back on itself with a motion that betrayed nothing. Not for you to publish, Matteo, for the precinct. For the rituals that secure this place. The archivist's jaw sharpened. He for specifics. Matteo's shoulders tightened and he answered in a half-truth. When the precinct was young, certain rites were recorded and kept. They are not for scholars. They are for those sworn to the safety of the house. The archivist's chest filled with a new shape of unease. Betrayal shifted toward fear. They returned to the reading alcove. Lucia set the packet beside the sealed folio with the matching sigil. The archivist unfolded the folio's crease and compared the strokes of the sigil to the packet's impression. The ink matched in style but not in age. The packet's strokes were recent. Lucia read aloud the marginal note she had found earlier in the sealed folio's edge. A modern marker with a date and a name. This is not preserved history. Lucia, this is instruction. Someone is using these pages. Her hands trembled. She touched the vellum and left the faintest smudge of blood. Brother Matteo appeared again in the corridor outside, summoned by the curator. He demanded explanation in a clipped voice and presented the archivist with an accusation that landed like a stone. Custody has been breached. Matteo, who allowed this to leave the vault. The archivist named procedure. Matteo, it was inadequate. The curator's presence blocked the archivist's attempts to push further. The curator placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and said, "We will handle this within the precinct," as if the problem could be closed by a phrased policy. The archivist insisted, and Lucia backed him in brief, sharp lines. Brother Matteo, Lucia, this folio references living names within our fold. You know that. Matteo's eyes flicked to her. Lucia, he said, and the single syllable used her name as a lever. Careful what you claim. The archivist heard the warning and heard the threat beneath it. His doubt shifted again, now toward suspicion that the keepers themselves sheltered complicity. They compared fingerprints. Lucia fetched an old glass slide and buttered the field with a pale powder used for latent prints. The archivist held the folio. He watched as Lucia lifted the powder with a fine brush and turned the page. The powder clung to the rolled ridge of a fingerprint at the margin. The archivist recognized the ridge pattern as he had recognized Lucia's face months before. Her name. Lucia's mouth flattened. She did not deny the match. The vault corridor's lamp flared. Voices rose outside, heavy boots marched. The archivist and Lucia both stiffened. The curator's hand slid to a pocket. His face became stone. Orders, he said. They are here. The door burst. Men in dark cloaks forced past the curator and Matteo. A masked courier he had seen once earlier ducked behind a hooded figure. One of the masked agents struck for the table. The archivist shoved the folio under the cloth. Lucia pushed him aside and a lamp toppled. Its flame guttered and left a smear on the table. In the struggle, the archivist seized a hand that reached for the packet and found the fingers of Lucia beneath the glove. He yanked, and there came the abrupt, coarse sound of a name spoken sharp and close. "Lucia," he said, and his voice held a question and an accusation. Lucia's face blurred, a small cut from the lamp's shattered glass. She spat out a line. "They made me sign for access." It was protection. Her words were short, rapid. She sounded like someone explaining a wrong choice to a jury. Brother Matteo stepped between them with a lift of arm and a command. "Enough," he said. For 3 heartbeats the corridor held, compressed. Then the leader of the agents, voice muffled behind a mask, barked orders, and the struggle broke into fists and lurches. The archivist felt a strike at his ribs and found himself against the stone. He tasted copper. A man in a dark cloak grabbed the folio and tore it from the table. The archivist lunged, fingers grazing vellum, and a slip of paper fell free. Lucia scrambled after it. Hands fought, curses clipped in low Italian. The archivist saw the slip settle on the floor, and, with a swift motion, Lucia snatched it and pressed it to her chest. The archivist watched her face when she read the line aloud. A modern notation followed by a cleric's name and a phrase that translated roughly to "for continuing rites." Lucia's eyes filled not with malice but with something that felt like grief. The archivist registered a twist he had not expected. Lucia was not the instigator. She had been made complicit. The leader of the agents snarled and claimed the sealed folio. He shoved Lucia aside and lifted the book with reverence that bordered on cruelty. "These pages are property of the order," he said, and the words hardened into a claim none of them could contest in that corridor. The archivist lunged forward, and Brother Matteo grabbed his wrist, speaking fast and low. "You have to stand down. If you speak, if you publish, you break an oath we hold that shields the precinct." The archivist wrenched his arm away. A rapid exchange followed, 3 to 5 lines pressed between them. "Brother Matteo, who else knows?" the archivist demanded. "Who performs these rites now?" Matteo replied, "Names are kept." "You are not cleared to know them," Lucia interrupted with a single sentence. "Then how do I account for blood on a page that lists a living cleric?" The leader of the agents stepped close and said, "Because the rites continue." "Because they must." The archivist's breath tightened. Uncertainty flipped into anger. The leader barked another order and his agents began to sift. They tore open parcels, they checked bindings. The curator tried to intervene and was shoved aside. He did not resist. The archivist saw the agents' masks nod subtly at each other, as if a code passed along in a glance. He moved to the vault interior and counted the sealed folios with his eyes. More than one bore the matching sigil. He felt his control slip. The curator's hand landed on his shoulder again, firmer this time. "We will reseal what must be resealed," the curator. And in that moment the archivist heard the decision crystallize. Containment over disclosure. Then came the reveal that broke the pattern. One of the agents hefted a fresh packet identical to the one that had arrived at the archivist's door. The agent peeled back the wax and revealed fresh marginalia that named Brother Matteo twice, and then included Lucia's initials. The archivist felt his throat close. He caught Brother Matteo's eyes and watched something like shame pass through them. Matteo's voice cracked when he spoke, a human fracture no one could perform intentionally. "I kept them from harm," he said. "I thought I was protecting people." His hands trembled. Lucia's fingers went to her mouth. She whispered, "They mean it was protection too. They paid for access to pages that kept watch on our square." Her sentence landed with a detail that changed how the archivist understood earlier nights. The sealed folios were used actively by a faction claiming to defend the precinct. The archivist's suspicion shifted into a new emotion. Complicity edged toward guilt. The masked leader stepped forward and gave a short order. The agents began to withdraw with selected folios. They left a thin, hard line of instruction. The archivist was to reseal the folios that night and file a report limited to institutional officers. No public disclosure, the archivist protested. The public has a right to know." The leader smirked around the mask. "There is no public right when lives are at stake," he said. "You would publish names and invite violence. We prevent that." The archivist imagined the names scrawled on a page and the men who would come to the doors. After they left, the archivist sat with Lucia and the curator in the wrecked reading alcove. The lamp put a small ring of light around their hands. The archivist counted the ways the night had shifted his certainties into a knot. Suspicion, doubt, fear, then the wider understanding that exposure could harm living people. Lucia's shoulders shook once and she pressed the slip of paper into her palm. "I wanted to stop it," she said. "I thought I could find the source." Her voice broke and then steadied. The archivist felt pity and frustration simultaneous. They worked until dawn. The archivist resealed the most dangerous folios, placing his own sign of custody on those he judged could do harm if released. He negotiated with the curator and with Lucia about which names to redact in their internal note. The curator insisted delicately but firmly. Lucia argued vehemently in clipped, urgent lines. The archivist listened to both and made a decision. Contain in service of safety. The choice rested heavy on him. Later, when the church bell tolled the hour, the archivist placed the antique key back on its carved peg. He felt his fingers shake. The scar along his left cheek pulsed with a remembered sting. Outside, on the square, a shadowed figure lingered in a doorway and watched the archive as if recording a pattern. The archivist stood on the threshold and mouthed the names he had just buried in the log. Matteo, curator Lucia. He did not speak them aloud beyond the room. He could not. He knew in the core of his actions that sealing the folios again had not ended anything. The packet at his door had demonstrated that ritual practice continued. The marginalia naming living clerics proved someone used the archive for present operations. He had chosen containment to limit harm, but he also carried the cost, a private complicity that would follow him through the precinct. He placed the lamp on the table, closed his folded vellum notes, and locked the door. At dusk the next day, he found a scrap of paper tucked beneath the lamp's base. A single line in Lucia's hand, neat and urgent. It read, "Meet at the vault at dusk. We decide together." The archivist folded the paper into his pocket and felt the slow shift of resolve. His suspicion remained. His doubt would reawaken. The new pattern, fear, compromise, personal responsibility, would drive him to the next choice. He slid the antique key back into its carved slot while the bell tolled once, and the archive's shutters closed on a secret kept between three people. Cardinal Severin slammed a sealed folio onto the archivist's table and did not wait for a reply. Suspicion tightened the archivist's hands. Suspicion had been a constant companion since the red fragment Lucia had torn from a wax seal had fallen between their palms. Severin's breath came short and precise. "Read this, Severin," and pushed a report across the worn wood. The report listed names, dates, and a corridor of disappearances tracing back to households whose marginal sigils matched the sealed folios. The archivist reached for the folio with one hand and kept the other on the report, as if the paper might slip away. The lantern in the antechamber threw hard light across Severin's powdered face. The archivist checked the room's entrance, then set the folio beside Lucia's fragment. He thought of the parcel that had scraped the threshold 2 nights before, blood-bound evidence that had smelled of iron and beeswax. That concrete smell returned now in memory, and in the metallic cadence of Severin's voice. "They are not past writings, Severin. They teach how to act. They teach violence." The archivist's jaw closed. He felt the motion of suspicion turn into calculation. He catalogued possibilities and consequences. Severin produced a folded ledger, acolytes missing, 1 carriage found emptied, a girl from Sant'Angelo vanished after attending a private mass. Names with the same household sigil appear in the margin of the folios. He tapped the ledger with a finger that did not tremble. The archivist read aloud 2 names and then stopped. He could not read the rest without imagining exact faces. He kept his voice low. "Show me the folio you received tonight," he said. Severin did not lift his eyes. "Brother Matteo found it in the chapel vestibule. He brought a man who fled that congregation, an acolyte who says he ran from the rite itself." Severin's fingers brushed an edge of the folio in a way that suggested ownership or perhaps defensiveness. The archivist opened the folio and the smell of vellum and dust rose, measured and familiar. He let the candle near the folio burn a fraction brighter and saw the seal. Fresh wax stamped with a sigil that matched 2 other folios he had catalogued. Lucia's torn fragment lay like evidence beside it. Brother Matteo arrived that night with the former acolyte in a corded cloak and a gaze peeled raw by fear. The acolyte's hands shook so that he wrapped them around the cloak's hem. He would not meet Severin. He kept looking at the folio and at the archivist. "Tell them what you told me, Brother Matteo," as if instructing a child. The acolyte spoke in a voice that rasped from lack of sleep. "They sang for blood," he said. "They named the household with the sigil. They brought a child. They drew the mark in the dirt." His words landed in the room like stones. The archivist took in the acolyte's detail. The way the acolyte had described the margin sigil, the stain at his sleeve hem, the precise order of the hymn. The archivist's suspicion shifted to alarm. The archivist set the folio on his desk and spread Lucia's earlier notes beside it. Lucia had been the one to break a wax seal with a single deliberate pull in an earlier morning. She had watched the red chip fall, and then reach for that tiny flake with the archivist holding his breath. The archivist remembered the prickling on his fingertips when the fragment hovered above the oak board. He remembered the way Lucia's voice had wrapped tight when she said the marginal sigil looked like a household brand. He now slid his fingertips along the folio's edge and felt a roughness where fresh ink had been pressed. Lucia and the archivist worked side by side at the desk. Lucia tilted her head, compared the marginal markings with the ledger Severin had supplied, and tapped a page. "This mark recurs in 3 ledgers belonging to Canon Aldi's house," she said. She named the canon with a certainty that struck the archivist as if she had found a map. The archivist's suspicion moved toward disbelief. Canon Ald had been a public figure of measured piety. He had watched Ald in the cathedral many times. Precise gestures at the altar, a ring that flashed like dull gold. Lucia folded her hands on the desk and did not look away. "I swear I saw this mark before," she said. They followed the hint from marginalia to ledger, ledger to household register, and household register to a name that made the archivist set his pen down. "Alder," he said. He pictured Alder's face as he had once seen it in a procession, quiet, polite, the sort of man who kept his hands clean in public. The archivist Lucia to fetch the ledger entries for the Alder household. She moved through the stacks with the sort of urgent care the archivist recognized from their earlier cataloging, turning in the narrow stairwell between stacks, cradling folios with both hands, fingers bearing ink stains from long nights of notes. The archivist felt the suspicion harden into a need, to test, to confront, to name. They confronted Canon Ald in his private chapel at candlelight. Ald stood with his back to a carved crucifix and did not look surprised. "Canon Ald," the archivist, marginally in the folios, "points to your house. People connected to that sigil have vanished." Ald's mouth curved. His eyes did not. "The archive makes claims often," Ald replied in a controlled voice. "What exactly do you accuse me of, archivist?" The archivist felt his voice move to steadiness by force. "This folio mirrors a right two witnesses swore they witnessed. Children, a mark in the dirt, name spoken. The ledger ties names to your household. Why?" Ald's fingers tightened around the rail behind him. Ald answered with questions that returned the accusation like a blade. "Why would I orchestrate abductions? Who benefits from telling such stories?" His tone carried an authority that attempted to reorder the room. The archivist named the ledger entries, the dates, the faces of those who had vanished. Ald's responses grew shorter. He offered no direct denials. Instead, he reached into his chest and produced specifics about the archivist's past, an apprenticeship long ago, an injury that had left a scar. The archivist felt betrayed in a way that made his hands clench. Ald's name suddenly used like leverage shifted the power of the conversation. Ald's veiled knowledge forced a new suspicion. Someone who protected the rights had access to private dossiers inside the cathedral. The archivist felt a second emotion shift, suspicion becoming anger. He advanced, edged the table, and asked, "Who you about my apprenticeship? Who watches my movements?" Ald's eyes flicked to the chapel door, then back. "We watch the archive because we guard the order, our eld," and the sentence landed as a threat. The archivist heard Lucia clear her throat behind him and felt the air between them tighten with immediate risk. He realized then that the conspiracy, if it existed, had structure and reach. Lucia broke silence. "I took a folio once," she said, and the confession struck the chapel like a bell. The archivist looked at her. Her hands were steady. She did not avert her gaze. "I thought it would be a protective ritual. Lucia, I marked the margin to remember the sigil. I performed a rite to keep a family safe. It went wrong." The archivist's suspicion folded into guilt. He recalled the first seal episode when Lucia had broken wax and a small red fragment had fallen. This was the concrete tie between their earlier action and the present danger. Brother Mateo's face sank. Lucia explained the protective ritual in short sentences. "I set salt around a door. I recited a psalm and painted a circlet on the threshold. The child grew sick." The family left the house 2 days later. The mark persisted. The archivist listened and asked precise questions. He needed detail, time, words, placement, so that he could test whether Lucia's improvised rites matched the folio's prescriptions. Lucia answered each question with clear recollection. The sequence of gestures, the measure of blood spilled on a cloth, the names murmured in the dark. The archivist realized that their interventions had consequences beyond theory. The protective ritual had not prevented harm. It may have attracted attention. At dawn, they traced a recent ledger entry to a deconsecrated chapel and followed the lead to a hidden crypt beneath it. Brother Mateo had insisted on accompanying them, and the former acolyte came too, his face pinched and pale. The archivist led with the stolen folio clutched against his chest. They moved down narrow stairs, wax dripped from half, burnt candles in the ceiling niche. The archivist's hands were steady, but his breathing had a shorter rhythm. He catalogued routes and exits even as his feet navigated the stairs. He could hear a muffled chant below, like hands scraping on stone. They found the doorway to the crypt partially concealed behind moved casks and a shivering curtain. Lucia pushed the curtain aside. The archivist counted 5 masked figures around an earthen pit, and another group pressed against the walls. They wore cloaks with familiar household sigils stitched inside the hems. A child knelt at the pit's edge. The acolyte's voice went thin. He mouthed the names as if checking the folio in his head. The archivist felt adrenaline, an immediate shift from anger to a tight, urgent clarity. He did not think of rhetorical possibilities. He reacted with a plan. "Stop," Brother Mateo shouted, and then, "Stop, in the name of the bishop!" The frozen chant cut. Masked congregants turned as if surprised by light and by the concrete intrusion. One of them reached under a cloak. The archivist moved before he could name his plan aloud. He shoved the folio across the stone lip, took a step into the crypt, and aimed to break their formation. Lucia went left, Brother Mateo went right. The acolyte collapsed to the floor, hands clasped over his mouth. The confrontation broke into immediate physical chaos. A masked figure lunged for the child. Lucia intercepted with a hand that struck a forearm and left a bruise that pulsed with red. The archivist grappled with a cloaked participant. The folio slipped and a corner of vellum opened to a page with an inked sigil. A lantern tipped. The candlelight flared and then guttered. The archivist felt heat from a small blaze and smelled oil and sweat. Rapid exchanges of 3 to 5 short lines broke out as people argued and demanded stop. The archivist dropped the child. "No," a masked voice said. "You cannot take what is necessary. Who are you?" Brother Mateo demanded, "Name yourself." "Lucia." In the scramble, a high-ranking cleric revealed himself by pulling off his mask. His face was not unfamiliar to the archivist, someone seen at services and on public rosters. The revelation changed the scene. Murmurs in the group turned to shoves and then to flight. The high-ranking cleric pushed aside a brazier and slipped between bodies toward a hidden stair. The archivist lunged, but the cleric vanished like a figure through a gap. Brother Mateo took a blow to the shoulder and fell. The archivist gathered him as Lucia dragged the child away from the pit. The acolyte sobbed words that were useless except to confirm details. They followed the folio's sequence exactly. They spoke the names. This concrete confirmation connected the sealed texts to living rites. They retreated through the vaulted corridor with a smuggled folio and a wounded Brother Mateo. The archivist wrapped Mateo's shoulder with a torn sleeve and felt the dampness of blood against wool. He kept one hand on the folio. His thumb brushed Lucia's folded notes. The group moved in urgency, counting steps and listening for pursuit. At one point the archivist heard a single, deliberate footstep in the distance and forced the trio into a shadowed alcove until it passed. He catalogued the sound. A boot on flagstone, then silence. The archivist's emotion shifted a final time toward grim resolve. The confrontation had no clean ending and required choices. Back in the study under lamplight, the archivist opened the smuggled folio and read by himself. He compared Lucia's protective marks with the inked prescriptions. The writing arranged ritual acts across a week, precise and numbered. It named offerings, sequences of prayer, and the placement of sigils on thresholds. The archivist considered translation as a tool. A translation could warn families or it could provide a manual. He measured the weight of that duality with concrete calculus, one life saved against the risk of dissemination. He set a note on his desk. Translate selectively, verify, do not publish. He circled 3 lines that referred to a household sigil repeated in the margins and marked them for immediate corroboration. He thought of Lucia's earlier confession and the way her protective rite had failed. He thought of Brother Mateo's shoulder and the acolyte's thin voice. He thought of Canon Alder's veiled threats and the high-ranking cleric's sudden unmasking. The archivist made a list. Who knew what, who had access, who could move between the archive and the chapel. He wrote names in the ledger and underlined alders. He closed the folio for the evening and wrapped it in cloth, then tucked it beneath the desk where the antique key in his satchel could fasten its binding. He felt the weight of physical objects, the cool metal of the key, the grit of vellum between his fingers, more immediate than any abstract horror. Before breaking the night's watch, he took one more step. He read Lucia's marginal note aloud to himself in a low voice, testing whether the sequence could be inverted or misread. The words were plain and precise. Names spoken aloud, a binding made through blood, a sigil pressed into soft clay. The archivist whispered the translation to check cadence and accuracy. He realized that the folio's language permitted multiple practical readings. He ranked them by danger and decided to address the most immediate threat first, the households with matching sigils. He assigned Brother Matteo to visit the 2 households nearest the vanished girl's last known location to ask questions discreetly and report back in person. Lucia would cross, check parish registers and the ledger for recurring names. The archivist would begin a cautious, partial translation focused on operative verbs and locations rather than rituals themselves. Their choices were plain actions, not speeches. Matteo, the archivist, go tonight. Ask about a delivery, a strange visitor. Do not mention the archive. Brother Matteo bowed and touched the injured shoulder, where the archivist's bandage held. Lucia nodded once and pocketed her folded vellum notes. They left the archive with the noise of the city beginning at the edges of dawn. The archivist walked the vaulted corridor with the folio secured at his hip. He heard the distant movement of a carriage and the slam of a gate. He felt the tangible distance between knowledge and action. Each step could bring them closer to saving someone, or to exposing the method to a larger audience that might misuse it. He laid out a plan that evening on the cedar table. Verify ledger ties, question households, map the network of sigils, and test the folio's prescriptions experimentally in controlled conditions. The archivist balanced risk in a ledger of its own. A small twist arrived in the form of an overlooked entry in Severin's report. A courier's name linked to Canon Aldi's household. It was a mundane scribble of a name that, when followed, produced a delivery log showing frequent trips between Aldi's house and a now empty townhouse on the North Quay. The archivist's mind rearranged possibilities. The twist changed what had looked like isolated ritual into organized logistics. He felt anger return and then sharpen into a plan. He Lucia to prepare a list of questions for anyone who met couriers. They resolved the immediate crisis of the night by tending to Brother Matteo, moving the child into Lucia's care, and transferring the smuggled folio into the archivist's satchel. They agreed on a translation protocol. Each dangerous operative phrase would be isolated, verified, and then sealed in an internal register accessible to 3 trusted clerics only. The archivist knew that even this partial transparency would risk exposure, but he also knew in concrete terms that inaction had already cost lives. He set the antique key into the satchel's loop and closed the clasp with a deliberate click. As morning light pooled across the study, the archivist sat alone and read the folio's last few lines once more. He heard the distant murmur of the cathedral bell and, beneath it, the soft footfall of a courier on the gravel outside the archive. He rose, moved to the window, and saw a figure disappear into an alley. He returned to his desk, placed the folio on top of Lucia's notes, and slid it into his leather satchel. He tightened the cord around the antique key and felt the metal rest against the pouch, cold and definite. He had decided to proceed with a cautious, selective translation that could save a life or risk releasing a manual of rights. He lowered himself into the chair, closed the study door, and heard a single click come from the corridor as someone turned a handle. The chapter resolved the immediate incursion beneath the deconsecrated chapel and exposed the presence of a high-ranking cleric among the congregants. But it left open who protected the rights inside the cathedral. The archivist's choices, how to translate, whom to trust, and when to act, were now contingencies recorded in ink and held in a small satchel until the next necessary move. He slid the smuggled folio into his leather satchel, closed the brass clasp, and listened as a distant door clicked twice down the corridor. He stepped into the crypt and found Lucia pressing a vellum folio against a ring of lit candles while a masked supplicant traced the exact sigil he'd catalogue. Suspicion tightened his hands around the lamp. He had handled those seals before, and the memory of red wax under his fingertips rose like a physical itch. The archivist moved forward on short, careful steps, and the candlelight cut across his face, making the thin scar on his left cheek glow. "Stop," he said. "Put the folio down." Lucia's hand trembled as she eased the book to the flagstones. The masked supplicant did not look at him, but kept the pen in motion, ink dark and wet on vellum. He smelled beeswax and iron, and a metallic tang that matched a parcel he'd dragged across the archive threshold weeks earlier. That parcel had scraped to a halt at his boot. He had crutched and lifted it, felt the same scent rise. Suspicion had been a rope tied to his decisions ever since Lucia, and he had shared that red fragment of wax. He had not let the rope slack now. He moved to intercept the folio, and Lucia stepped in front of him, palms flat to the cover. "Archibald," she said, using the familiar form of his title in a voice that sought alliance. "Don't do this in front of them." "Who are they?" he asked, and his voice did not hide the question's weight. He reached for the folio. A masked hand lashed out and knocked his lamp. The light rolled, guttered, and then flared as someone lunged. The archivist grabbed the folio before it could be snatched, and felt the vellum's edge cut a crescent of skin on his fingertip. He smelled blood and dust, and the faint oily smell of centuries between pages. Lucia pushed at him hard enough to jar his knees. "Give me the book," she whispered. The conflict was raw and immediate. The archivist pulled back, and the room tightened to the scrape of leather and the whisper of turning pages. The candles flickered, and the masked supplicant finished tracing the last loop of the sigil. Outside the crypt, footsteps sounded on flagstones above. Someone moved along the corridor. The archivist's suspicion turned into a practical choice. Hold the folio and force a reckoning, or hand it over and let the ritual continue. He backed toward a pillar and read the marginalia visible at the folio's edge. The handwriting matched the blood. Browned note he'd seen months earlier under a lamp in the archive alcove. That note had named places in the city and a list of clerical officers. The archivist felt the first shift, suspicion to alarm. Lucia, who supplied this. She kept her hands on the folio as if to protect it. Not its words, but the people who used it. "It came to me in pieces, Lucia. A packet at the choir door. I thought," her voice broke, "I thought only to catalogue, like you taught me. Catalogue with me now." The archivist. He folded a corner of vellum back and read aloud so others could hear. "Names, 3 households, 2 parish priests, 1 chancellery clerk." He pronounced each name and watched the reactions. The masked supplicant lowered the pen. Lucia's jaw tightened. The archivist sharpened his fingers against the folio to steady his breath. They moved from the crypt to the stone altar where the struggle widened. The archivist did not want violence, but he was prepared to hold ground. He felt a tremor in his hands, anger or fear. It was both. His jaw clenched and the scar across his cheek itched where the candle had brushed it. "Cardinal Severin sent me this." Lucia suddenly. Her eyes darted to the doorway. He wanted it sealed. It should never be read aloud. The archivist's mouth went dry. He remembered the day Severin had slammed a sealed folio on his table. Breath hard and precise, "Read this." Severin had said then. The memory kept the same rhythm of threat. Brother Matteo arrived at the alcove by the time they had rested the folio onto the reading table. Matteo's sleeves bore smudges of lamp oil and his hands smelled faintly of baking bread. He bent over the pages and worked with a steady, practiced patience that steadied the room. "Let me see." "Matteo." He pushed a lamp closer, the light highlighting the script's small, tight letters. Matteo brushed aside a blood-browned scrap and blew gently. Dust lifted like a sheet and settled again. He read aloud a marginal note, and the words named a ritual protocol tied to a sacramental rite. The archivist felt the second shift, alarm to a cold, measured dread that required action. "This is not a relic, Matteo, this is instruction." They used the rites as they were written. He laid a hand flat on the folio. "This is a list of those who have shared the sacrament and those who have received special absolution. Dialogue cut into the air then, short and urgent. Matteo, the archivist. Who else knows this? Matteo hesitated, a small tightening at his mouth. More than a few. Matteo answered, some are clerics, some are lay patrons, some sit in robes at councils. I have seen names on lists before, but not tied to a protocol so plainly. He looked at Lucia. You should not have brought it to the crypt. Lucia's shoulders rose. You should not have come at night, she said. Words met words for several breaths. The archivist pushed harder. Cardinal Severin must be told. Lucia's eyes flashed. He me to seal it. He me to consign it to the vault. He exposure would endanger people. The archivist's hands hovered over the pages. The folio sat between the desire to publish and the duty to protect. Severin's arrival made the room narrower. He appeared in the vaulted corridor wrapped in his formal cope, the hem stained by the corridor dust. He spoke with the clipped authority of a man wielding a reputation. Archivist, he said, you hold danger by the palm. Place the folio on the shelf and lock it. For the church, for the city, the archivist met his gaze and saw the thinly veiled threat behind the words. Severin set his gloved hand on the reading table, and the leather thinned under pressure. You want it revealed, the archivist, you want it hidden. Severin did not answer directly. He instead, to expose certain names will bring ruin to many innocents. Think of the family's archibald. Think of the cathedral's role. Think of blood spilled in visible ways. The words were precise. The archivist's chest tightened, and he found his hands clenching the folio until the vellum groaned. The tension bent toward betrayal when Brother Matteo admitted his role. Matteo had kept his hands steady, but his face fell in a manner that cut. He produced a folded list from his inner vestment and laid it on the table. The archivist recognized a clerical title on the list, and then another, and then a name he had seen in the marginalia months before. I diverted sacramental access for certain men, Matteo allowed. I allowed private rights. I have kept names for decades. His admission landed like an iron tool. Matteo! Lucia hissed, why would you? Her voice broke. Matteo looked at her with a wariness that did not excuse the choice. I thought I helped them, Lucia. I thought I spared them from external violence. I thought I spared the church scandal. The archivist's first emotion had been suspicion, then alarm. Now betrayal pressed like a weight behind his ribs and set his muscles to decision. They argued in a series of short lines that sharpened faster than any blade. You kept lists. The archivist demanded, you gave rights to those who were not permitted. It was mercy, Matteo. Mercy is not always lawful. You made policy private. Severin snapped, you made mercy into conspiracy. You cover names to spare the church's face. Lucia to Severin, you kept us from the truth. The exchange ran through 3 to 5 quick retorts. Voices rose and fell with the small alarms of the archive. The claimer outside hinted at mobilization. Footsteps multiplied in the corridor. A masked supplicant returned to the doorway and peered in. The archivist counted the time between sounds and decided the only way to force clarity was to copy the folio. He moved to the desk under the single lamp where he kept his copying tools. A thin, lead stylus, a sheet of clean vellum, and a small press. He felt an urgency that had nothing to do with moral certainty and everything to do with preventing unseen harm. If the names reach public hands, he said, the violence will be visible. If they remain secret, the rights continue. We must choose what ends first. Lucia watched him. You will copy it, she asked. He answered by setting the folio open, placing clean vellum under a gentle weight, and beginning to trace letters with a practiced hand. His fingers moved with the rhythm of decades of cataloging. Matteo bent over him and whispered corrections. The masked supplicant lingered at the doorway. The archivist's copying was interrupted by a sudden surge. A man in a cardinal's livery shoved through, and Cardinal Severin's face was pale with an anger that made his voice low and purposeful. Stop him? Severin ordered to 2 clerics at his side. They lunged, hands closed on the archivist's shoulders. The lamp leap flamed and spilled light in a wild arc. Vellum slid. A page bent and the ink smudged into a spiderweb of ruin. Someone shouted a name the archivist had traced for the city ledger. The room turned into a contest for the book. There was a quick, violent scramble. Lucia tried to shield the folio with her body. Matteo moved between the cardinal and the archivist as if his presence might moderate the collision. The masked supplicant slapped at the lamp, scattering hot wax. The archivist's sleeve caught flame for a second, and he smacked at it, using the back of his hand. He felt a sharp sting and smelled burnt cloth. The fight was tactile, hard leather, brittle vellum, the thud of a shoulder against an oak table. In the middle of the struggle a hand, Lucia's, slid into the archivist's palm and thrust a small scrap of vellum toward him. "Take it," she hissed. "Take it and go." The archivist felt the weight of the scrap, the fibers rougher than the folio, a blotch of ink and a smear of dried blood at the corner. He glanced up. Severin's eyes had an edge of command. Lucia shoved him backward. The archivist made the choice in a fraction. Keep the original and risk public exposure in a bruising purge, or take the fragment with names that could be traced and attempt to expose the network more carefully. He clutched the scrap, folded it within his coat, and felt the second major emotion shift, betrayal to grim resolve. When the surge eased, the folio had been pushed into a wooden chest and locked. Severin closed the lid and placed his hand on the key. "This remains with the church," he said in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Lucia's face went still. Matteo's hand trembled as he tried to retrieve the list, but Severin shook his head. "Enough, Severin. This ends now. We secure it. We make a decision in private." The archivist's jaw tightened. He had not expected the church to choose concealment over investigation. That choice altered his sense of where responsibility lay. The aftermath poured into the archive steps, an outer corridor like water into a basin. The archivist stumbled down the stone steps with Lucia at his side. She kept her thumb pressed where the red fragment had torn. "Why did you give it?" he asked. "Why did you take the scrap?" Lucia studied him. "Because someone must remember the names who are not named anywhere else," she said. "Because if we do not keep at least a thread, those people disappear into a system that will never answer for them." He listened and felt the last of the night's adrenaline give way to fatigue. They parted in the grey light of dawn. Lucia slipped away with a fragment of the folio hidden beneath her sleeve. A fragment, not the full truth, but a seed of proof. Matteo remained behind, his confession clinging like dust to the edge of his robe. Cardinal Severin returned to the vault with a measured gait and a cloak that flapped against the stone. The archivist watched them go and felt the city wake around him, the bell of the cathedral striking first hour, a cart rattling over cobbles, a woman calling for bread. The world continued in its practical motions. At his desk in the dim morning, the archivist laid the scrap flat and opened the small press he used for copying. He set the paper and rubbed the stylus over letters until the ink left a faint impression. He wrote plainly, in a cipher he had used only twice before. Names, dates, locations, the single phrase that would consign these pages to future hands, but not to the present scandal. His fingers trembled. He traced the thin vertical scar on his cheek again, as if to steady himself. The third emotion shift moved inside him now, resolved to heavy remorse. He had chosen secrecy to preserve lives, and he had learned that secrecy often became complicity. He sealed the copied note into a false folio and slid the antique key on its cord beneath his satchel, where only he would remember. He wrote one line in a code of his own making, a warning and a request. He did not write names for open reading. He wrote instructions for a future investigator who might be willing to pry at the church's seams. He placed the note in the inner lining of his coat and bound the false folio with wax bearing the same red seal that had first stained his fingers. He did not invite anyone to witness this work. He moved in the archive with the silence of someone who knows too much and speaks too little. He thought of the red fragment Lucia had lifted months prior, how it had fallen between their palms. He remembered lifting it before it touched the floor and feeling the prickle at his fingertips. That moment had seeded all that followed. He thought of the parcel scraped across the threshold, the scent of iron and beeswax, the way he had crouched and found sigils identical to the folios. He thought of Cardinal Severin slamming a folio onto his table and ordering him to read. All those moments had been concrete events, and now they conjoined into the ledger of choices. When the doors closed on the archivist felt the weight of names he could not speak aloud. He had chosen to protect some people and to risk others by preserving the small set of facts for later. He had chosen partial exposure. He had also chosen concealment. He had recorded his choice in the code and left it where he believed someone with the patience and moral clarity of a slow, precise historian might find it. He had not stopped the ritual network. He had made a map of its seams. He set his spectacles on the desk and cleaned them with the hem of his sleeve. The brass compass on his chain sat cold against his palm. He had reconfigured it long ago into a sigil tool, and now it seemed only to measure moral direction. He inhaled the dry parchment smell, the beeswax, and a faint ozone of candle smoke. His body felt the ache of battle and the small fire of resolve. He wrote a single, careful marginalia in Latin in the sealed folio, an index note that would later be found by someone working from outside the church hierarchy. Outside the cathedral square, life arranged itself in a pattern that ignored the night's decisions. Merchants set their stalls. A child chased a hoop. A bell clapped the quarter hour. Inside the archive, the archivist sealed the false folio into the chest and reset the lock. He slid the real key into his satchel but left the chest's visible lock intact so that others might find nothing at a cursory glance. He had not acted cleanly. He had acted to preserve evidence. Before he left, he wrote one last short line on a scrap and slipped it into Lucia's palm when she returned for a moment to the corridor. "Keep this with you," he said. Lucia nodded and folded the scrap into her own sleeve. "If you go," he added, using the quiet form of counsel he had learned in a lifetime of cataloging risk. "Find Brother Matteo. Keep him safe. Name him if you must." Her mouth twisted. "Archibald," she said, "I will keep what you ask. But you must promise." She did not finish. He did not make promises he could not keep. He only tightened the strap on his satchel and walked beneath the stone arches toward the inner stair. The door closed behind him with a finality that was not absolute. There would be other doors. Alone at his desk as morning settled, he transcribed a coded summary of events and placed it into the false folio. He sealed his note, pressed wax, and then slid the key into a hollow under the satchel. He catalogued the incident in his private register using cross-references only he could follow. He did not write a grand statement or a public announcement. He wrote precise coordinates, names, rituals referenced, dates, and a note that the folio was active, not inert. He wrote with the measured hand of a man who knew the cost of words. A final knock sounded at the archive door as he closed his ledger. He did not turn immediately. After a breath, he opened the door and found a messenger with a wrapped parcel and a single line of verse pinned to its ribbon. The messenger said only, "For the archivist." From a friend, the archivist took the parcel and slit the ribbon. Inside was a small mirror and a note. An old instrument for old hands. He smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and set the mirror among his copying tools. The mirror reflected his face and the scar. It reminded him he would bear the mark of this choice for the rest of his life. He stacked the sealed folios and catalogued a new entry. Fourth seal, partial removal, names preserved in private cipher. He closed the ledger and slid the false folio into a shelf behind a row of innocuous parish records. He turned the key beneath his satchel and felt the metal against his palm. He had chosen to keep a record that protected some people and exposed others later. He had chosen to preserve the possibility of reckoning without forcing a public rupture. Outside, the city adjusted. Inside the archive, light shifted across oak and vellum. The archivist sat for a long while, fingertips ink-stained, spectacles reflecting a small ring of lamp flame. He pressed his thumb to the seam where the false folio rested and let the decision settle into his bones. He had not unmade the networks. He had marked them. He had not saved everyone. He had left a trail. He sealed a final note and slid it beneath the false folio's binding. The note read in the archivist's cipher, "Watch the names in the chancery and the East Parish. Recompense if you can find the child from House Castell." Then he closed the desk, shouldered his satchel, and took the antique key from its hiding place. He slid the key into the palm of his hand and felt its worn teeth against his skin. He left the archive and locked the outer gate, but he did not return Severin's gaze. He had weighed his complicity and chosen a course that would haunt him. The final beat came as he locked the door. A concrete decision, a physical act. He had copied, he had concealed, and he had left a way for another to follow. He had acted with suspicion at first, allowed that to become anger, then betrayal, and finally a heavy, resolute shame that would shape his days. He closed the chest, hid the key, and walked out into a city that would not know what had been done for many years. The archive itself remained the same in outward form, but inside its shelves lay names that might one day be called to account. The archivist's reckoning was no public verdict but a private ledger. He folded his coat, tightened the strap of his satchel, and left the archive's lamp to gutter into the ordinary morning light.